But first, and before all that, let's discuss whether the government actually can stop the boats with Alexander Downer. Lovely to see you this morning.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Camilla.
Look, it's not a great weekend, is it? We've seen more deaths in the Channel. We've had this, I'd say it's a fiasco with the Bibby Stockholm having to be removed of migrants because of Legionnaires. It was meant to be the Stop the Boats week. Catherine, on our People's panel, wanted me to ask you, what can the government do to rescue this, I would say, shambolic approach to trying to stop the boats? Because it's not working, Alexander.
Well, at the heart of it is going to be third country processing of these asylum seekers, and so that is Rwanda.
I know, but then they've sent, as Labour have said, they've sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than actual deportees.
Well, they haven't sent any deportees to Rwanda, and I think 2 Home Secretaries have been to Rwanda, so 2 is more than naught. However, they just have to overcome the legal problems they have. One way or another, they have to do that. So it's now going to the Supreme Court. These court hearings and decisions, they just take forever. But they've got to be determined to pursue this whole Rwanda, as we call it, the Rwanda option, because you have to break the business model of the organised crime gangs who are bringing these people across. You have to break their business model. And it's as simple as this. The people, the asylum seekers, pay 3,000-4,000 euros per person to come across. If they know that they can't get to the UK or can't stay in the UK and will end up in Rwanda or anywhere else, they won't pay the 3,000 to 4,000 euros in the first place.
When
so
you've got
to break that business
When
model.
you tried it in Australia, and obviously you successfully put people off landing on Australian shores by processing them in Nauru, did you have all of these legal challenges? Is the difference between us and you the ECHR and the fact that we probably have to leave it in order to further our own
number one,
policy aims?
We anticipated there would be, what are here called lefty lawyers, lodging all sorts of cases. There would be a massive litigation. So we lined up the laws as best we could to avoid that, to make sure, because after all, the Parliament makes the law, not the lawyers. So the laws were substantially changed in Australia. I won't go into how we changed them. And secondly, it is a fair point where Australia is not part of the Europe, is not part of the European Convention on Human Rights. The UK is. The Strasbourg Court has expanded its remit very substantially over the last few years, and that is potentially, not for certain, potentially a major legal obstacle. But we'll see when the Supreme Court finally rules on this case. Yeah. But if the government wins in the Supreme Court, then more or less, figuratively, the next day they can start sending people to Rwanda. I'd say the other thing is it's got to be comprehensive. Everybody who comes across on a small boat like this needs to know they'll end up in Rwanda. They all need to know that.
If we lose in the Supreme Court, do we then look at leaving the ECHR?
Well, it depends why the Home Office would lose in the Supreme Court. It would depend what the court said. It's possible that the law could be changed. It's possible that there could be some modification of the scheme in Rwanda. In extremis, I suppose the UK could leave the European Convention. That would be pretty dramatic to leave a convention like that. Yeah. Hopefully the legal problems can be solved without that being necessary.
I know that you did this review into our border force and you gave it to former Home Secretary Priti Patel. I just wouldn't mind your analysis of the Home Office. Back in the day when he was Home Secretary, I think it was 17 years ago, John Reid said it wasn't fit for purpose. The phrase I'm always told about the Home Office is that it's a basket case. Do you agree with that? Does it need total reform, this department?
I know the Home Office reasonably well. It's 40,000 people. Some of them are geniuses and some of them aren't. So it has a very, very difficult job. Some of the work they do very well. Let's just take this issue of illegal migrants. Picking them up, bringing them in, processing them, understanding who has arrived, making sure people don't get here unaccounted for, they do a pretty good job.
Do they? I mean, we've got this historic high of 100,000 coming in by the channel.
Over several years, though, since 2018.
But it's still much higher than it was pre-pandemic.
No, what they
seems like there's a complete lack of grip, actually, and a lack of distinguishing between people legitimately seeking asylum in this country and economic migrants.
Yes, come to that. So I think there's some of the functional things the Home Office does, it actually does quite well. It's easy to be critical, but I actually think some of the things they do quite well. Here is a real issue that I don't think is being addressed in the UK, and that is, why do so many people who apply for refugee status have it granted in the UK? Yes. Where, I mean, I stand to be corrected, but I think something like 75% of all applications are approved by the Home Office, whereas in the EU, in a country like France, only about 35% of applications.
This is the question. Is it because there are officials in the Home Office who are anti the government's own immigration policy and are ticking boxes and letting people in when they shouldn't?
I'm not sure I'm not sure of the answer to this, but it's possibly not the officials, it's possibly the law.
Yes.
And that the government hasn't sufficiently changed the law to define more strictly what a refugee is. Now, a refugee is meant to be somebody who is fleeing from persecution and looking for, if you like, protection, to use the word of the language of the Refugee Convention, looking for somewhere safe to go. That isn't the same thing as turning somebody into a migrant.
No.
And what the government is doing is making all people who apply for refugee status who have it granted, and we're not sure on what basis it is being granted, on what basis they're just fleeing a country that nobody likes, as distinct from them personally fleeing persecution. They're personally being persecuted. And then they're turned into migrants.
Yeah. Whereas
in Australia, one of the things we did was, with people who were found to be refugees, we gave them temporary protection visas. We said, OK, we'll look after you for a year, and at the end of that year, we'll review your situation, and if back home the persecution has come to an end, there's political change or whatever has happened, and it's safe for you to go home, we'll send you back home. But our obligation is to protect you, not to convert you into a migrant. We have a separate program for migrants, and we decide who comes to Australia.
And that's what you'd recommend our government does, basically?
I would recommend they review a lot of these things that we've been talking about this morning. I think they should introduce temporary protection visas. I think the Home Secretary and other ministers, the Immigration Minister, need to look at the definition of refugees.
Yeah.
They need to look at the Refugee Convention, look at what the courts have been doing, and ask the question, why are so many applications being accepted in the UK, whereas they're being rejected in the EU? All of these questions, I think, are really important questions to follow through.
I mean, these are questions that have been facing the Tories for the last 13 years. But Alexander Downer, thank you very much indeed for your insight. Lovely to speak to you this morning. Some very good suggestions there. If only the Home Secretary and the Home Office would listen. I'm sure Robert Jenrick and indeed Suella Braverman will be saying they're doing all this, but it doesn't seem to be making much progress.